Margaret Wilson sat on the wooden porch of her modest suburban home, the golden hues of the evening sun casting long shadows across the quiet street. The neighborhood, though peaceful, felt emptier than ever. The crisp autumn air carried the distant laughter of children playing in nearby yards, a sound that once filled this very house, but had long since faded. At 70 years old, Margaret had seen her fair share of love and loss. She had buried her husband years ago and had come to accept solitude as a quiet companion. But nothing had prepared her for the grief of losing her daughter Emily and the silent burden of raising a granddaughter who had been left behind, abandoned by the only parent she had left. Lily Anderson, a delicate 3-year-old girl, played alone in the front yard, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized sweater she wore. The sleeves bunched up around her hands as she clutched a small stuffed bear, one of the few things she had from her mother. Born premature, Lily had always been fragile, her health a constant worry for Margaret. But despite everything, she possessed a quiet resilience, a determination to find happiness even in the smallest of moments. She had never known her mother, and her father had walked away before she was old enough to remember his face. Still, there were nights when she would wake up crying, asking for someone who was no longer there. Margaret watched from the porch, her heart heavy. She had done everything she could to fill the void, to give Lily the love and stability she needed. But there were things that a grandmother could not replace. The girl needed more than warm meals and bedtime stories. She needed a companion, someone who could make her feel safe in a way Margaret no longer could. Her gaze drifted toward the large figure lying near the garden, a muscular 5-year-old Pitbull with a dark coat and a history that was just as troubled as Lily's. Max had arrived at their home only a few weeks ago, an adoption Margaret had hesitated over. She had never owned a Pitbull before, and like many, she had her reservations. The breed had an unfair reputation, one built on fear and misunderstanding. But when she had visited the shelter, something in Max's eyes had stopped her. He had been different from the other dogs, silent, watchful, as though he no longer expected kindness. He had seen hardship, and so had she. Maybe, just maybe, they could find something in each other. Max had spent most of his life fending for himself. Found abandoned on the streets, he had been brought into the shelter after a long battle for survival. He bore the scars, some visible, some not. Though he had been cared for at the shelter, no one had chosen him. Families came and went, picking out puppies with eager tails and bright, untainted eyes. But not Max. He was too big, too intimidating. No one had wanted to take a chance on him, until Margaret did. Now here he was, lying in the grass, his ears twitching at the rustling of the wind, but his body completely still. Since arriving, he had remained distant, never aggressive but never affectionate either. He would follow Margaret's instructions, eat his meals without fuss, and keep to himself. But something had shifted since meeting Lily. Though he rarely sought attention, he never strayed far from the little girl, his dark eyes always tracking her movements with quiet interest. Lily, unaware of the cautious tension lingering between the adults and the dog, had no fear of Max. She had taken to him instantly, as though sensing something in him that others had overlooked. Every morning she greeted him with a soft, "Hi, Max," before toddling off to play. And every evening, before going inside, she would whisper, "Good night, Max," as if she knew he would be there to watch over her while she slept. Tonight was no different. As the sky turned a deeper shade of orange, Lily wandered toward Max, her small feet making soft crunching noises against the fallen leaves. Margaret tensed slightly, still unsure of how much she could trust the dog. He had never shown aggression, but trust was something that had to be earned, and they were still learning about each other. Lily, however, had already decided. She stopped right in front of Max, who lifted his head slightly to acknowledge her. Without hesitation, she reached out and placed her tiny hand on top of his broad head. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Then something remarkable happened. Max, the once wary, untrusting survivor, closed his eyes. Not out of fear, not out of resistance, but in acceptance. It was as if, in that simple touch, he understood what she was offering. A connection, a bond not built on past pain, but on something new. Lily smiled, her fingers curling slightly in Max's fur. "Max," she whispered, as though speaking his name made it real. "Stay with me." Margaret's eyes softened. There, in that quiet moment, she saw it. An unspoken agreement forming between a child who had never known security and a dog who had never known unconditional love. Two lost souls finding each other. The old woman exhaled, the tightness in her chest loosening just a little. Maybe, just maybe, bringing Max home hadn't been a gamble. Maybe it had been fate. Margaret pushed herself up from the porch, stepping toward the duo, her voice gentle but firm. "Come on, sweetheart. It's getting late." Lily looked up at her grandmother, then back at Max. With a final pat, she whispered, "Good night, Max," before turning and running toward the house. Margaret hesitated before following. As she turned, she caught something, just the briefest flicker of movement. Max, who had remained still for so long, had lifted his head slightly, his eyes watching the little girl disappear into the house. A subtle shift, but a shift nonetheless. Margaret smiled to herself. Maybe trust wasn't built in a single moment, but it had to start somewhere. And tonight, it had. Lily's days had become brighter since Max arrived. Though she had always been a quiet child, content with playing by herself, there was a newfound excitement in her small world. Every morning, as soon as she woke up, she would peer out the window to see if Max was still there. And every time, without fail, she would find him lying in the same spot near the porch, his dark eyes watching the yard as if guarding something precious. Margaret had been observing them closely. At first, she was cautious, watching for any signs that Max might not be as gentle as Lily believed. But what she saw surprised her. Max never barked at Lily, never flinched when she ran up to him, and never ignored her presence. He wasn't overly playful like other dogs, but his patience with Lily was undeniable. Wherever she went, Max was never too far behind. One afternoon, Margaret sat on the porch with a cup of tea, letting the warm breeze brush against her skin. She watched as Lily waddled across the yard, her little feet kicking up tiny clouds of dust. Max followed closely, his massive paws moving in slow, deliberate steps. It was a peculiar sight, this small, fragile child walking beside such a powerful dog. But there was something so natural about it, as if they had always belonged together. Lily had taken to bringing Max small gifts. A leaf she found particularly interesting, a flower she picked from the garden, or even a tiny rock she thought was special. Each time she would place it in front of him, waiting for a reaction. And though Max never wagged his tail or jumped with excitement, he always acknowledged her gestures, sometimes with a slow blink, sometimes with a slight tilt of his head. One day, as Margaret was folding laundry inside, she heard Lily giggling outside. Curious, she peeked out the window. Lily was sitting in the grass, babbling away in her sweet toddler language, and Max was lying next to her, his ears flicking occasionally as if listening. Lily was placing flowers on Max's back, arranging them carefully like she was decorating a cake. Max remained still, unbothered by the tiny hands working diligently on his fur. Margaret smiled to herself. She had been worried about bringing Max into their home, but now she was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what Lily needed. The real change, however, came one evening when Margaret least expected it. It had been a long day, and after dinner, Margaret had tucked Lily into bed, reading her a short bedtime story before turning off the lights. As she closed the door behind her, she let out a tired sigh. Raising a toddler at her age wasn't easy, but she would do anything for Lily. She had barely sat down in the living room when she heard soft whimpers from Lily's room. At first, she thought Lily was talking in her sleep, but the sounds grew into quiet sobs. Margaret's heart clenched. She knew what this was. It wasn't the first time Lily had cried herself to sleep, though she rarely did it when Margaret was near. Margaret was about to get up when something stopped her. The soft padding of paws against the wooden floor. Maximum. She watched in silence as Max, moving with an almost human-like understanding, walked down the hallway toward Lily's room. Margaret followed quietly, peeking through the doorway. Lily was curled up in her bed, her tiny body shaking slightly as she cried into her pillow. Max stood at the entrance, his ears perked forward, his head tilted as if assessing the situation. Then, with a careful, deliberate motion, he stepped inside. Margaret held her breath. Max approached the bed and gently placed his head on the mattress, right next to Lily. He didn't make a sound, didn't try to move her, didn't demand attention. He simply stayed there, his presence alone a silent reassurance. Lily hiccuped, her sobs slowing down as she turned her head. Her big, teary eyes met Max's, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then, with the trust that only a child could give so easily, Lily reached out a small hand and rested it on Max's head. Margaret watched as Lily's breathing steadied, her tiny fingers curling slightly into Max's fur. Within minutes, her eyes fluttered shut, her body relaxing into sleep. And Max? He didn't move. He stayed right there, beside her bed, as if standing guard over her dreams. Margaret wiped at her own eyes before quietly stepping back. She had been the one to bring Max home, thinking she was rescuing him. But maybe it wasn't just Max who had needed saving. Maybe in some way they had all been lost, waiting to find each other. From that night on, Max was no longer just a dog in their home. He was Lily's guardian, her silent protector. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret allowed herself to believe that everything was going to be okay. The air had grown colder in recent days. Autumn was beginning its slow retreat, making way for the crisp bite of winter. The once vibrant leaves that covered the Andersons' yard had faded into brittle remnants of gold and crimson, swirling in the wind before settling onto the damp earth. The sky hung low and gray, as if carrying the weight of the approaching season. Inside the house, the warmth of a crackling fireplace contrasted with the chilly world outside. Margaret sat on the couch, knitting quietly, the rhythmic motion of her hands soothing her nerves as she listened to the faint hum of the television in the background. Lily sat on the floor with Max, her tiny fingers tracing patterns into his thick fur as she mumbled softly to herself, lost in a world of make-believe. Max, as always, lay still beside her, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and steady. Over the past few weeks, their connection had deepened in ways Margaret never could have predicted. Max had gone from being a silent observer to Lily's shadow, following her wherever she went. When she played in the yard, he was there. When she colored in her picture books, he was at her feet. When she took her afternoon nap, he rested beside her bed. Margaret had come to trust him in a way she never thought she would. But there were still nights when Lily's fragile heart betrayed her. It started with small changes, subtle but noticeable. Lily became quieter. She spent longer staring out the window, watching the empty road that led away from their home. Her laughter, once so easily given, became less frequent, her playful energy dimming like a candle in the wind. Margaret had seen this before. She knew why. Lily was beginning to ask the questions Margaret had long dreaded. One night, after Lily had gone to bed, Margaret was cleaning up the kitchen when she heard a soft, hesitant voice behind her. "Grandma?" Margaret turned, surprised to see Lily standing there, her small frame swallowed by her nightgown, her stuffed bear dangling from one hand. "Sweetheart, what are you doing up?" Margaret set down the dish towel, walking over to kneel in front of her. "You should be in bed." Lily shifted on her feet, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Grandma, where's my mommy?" Margaret's heart clenched. She had known this day would come. She reached out, tucking a loose curl behind Lily's ear. "Your mommy loved you very much, sweetheart." "Is she coming back?" Lily asked, her voice so small, so full of innocent hope. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. "No, sweetheart, she's not coming back." Lily's lower lip trembled. Why not? Margaret wished she had the right words. But how could she explain something so painful to a child so young? "Sometimes people we love have to go away," she said gently. "But that doesn't mean they stop loving us. Your mommy is watching over you every day." Lily was silent for a long moment, then whispered, "What about my daddy?" Margaret stiffened. This was the question she had feared most. She took a slow breath. "Your daddy, he had a hard time when your mommy left. He didn't know how to take care of you the way he should have. So he left too. Did he love me?" Margaret felt her chest tighten. How could she answer that without breaking the little girl's heart? She cupped Lily's face in her hands, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "You are loved more than anything in this world, Lily. By me, by your mommy, and by Max." At the mention of Max, Lily turned her head, looking toward the living room. The Pitbull was still lying in his usual spot, but his ears were up, eyes watching them with quiet attentiveness. Lily pulled away from Margaret and slowly walked over to him. Max didn't move as Lily climbed onto the couch beside him, curling up against his warm body. He let out a slow, deep breath and nudged her hand gently with his nose. Lily sniffled, pressing her face against his fur. "You won't leave me, right, Max?" Margaret's breath hitched. Max shifted, resting his head beside Lily, his quiet presence offering the only answer needed. And in that moment, Margaret knew. Max was more than just a dog. He was family. That night, Margaret thought Lily would finally find peace in Max's presence. But just a few days later, the real storm hit. Lily had come down with a fever. It started with small sniffles, but by nighttime, her tiny body was burning up. Margaret did everything she could, cooling cloths, medicine, holding her close, but nothing soothed Lily's discomfort. She whimpered softly in her sleep, twisting and turning, too exhausted to stay awake but too miserable to rest peacefully. Max wouldn't leave her side. At first he simply lay by the bed, watching her intently, ears perked at every sound she made. But as Lily's fever worsened, Max began to grow restless. He whined, nudging her arm with his nose as if trying to wake her up. "Max, she's okay," Margaret murmured, though her voice wavered with doubt. But Max wasn't convinced. He circled the bed, his tail low, his head pressing against Margaret's arm in clear distress. And then, something incredible happened. Lily, in the midst of her fever-induced sleep, let out a soft whimper. Max jumped onto the bed. Margaret barely had time to react before the large Pitbull gently curled his body around Lily, his warmth enveloping her small frame. Margaret gasped. She should have stopped him, should have pulled him off the bed, but something held her back. Because in that moment, Lily, who had been restless and uncomfortable all night, finally let out a tiny sigh. And then she stilled. Margaret watched in stunned silence as Lily's breathing steadied, her tiny hands gripping Max's fur in her sleep. Max didn't move, didn't make a sound. He simply stayed there, keeping her safe. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. For so long she had worried about protecting Lily, about keeping her safe, about giving her something stable in a world that had already taken so much from her. But maybe she wasn't the only one watching over Lily. Maybe Max had been sent here for a reason. Margaret reached out, brushing a gentle hand over Max's head. "Good boy," she whispered. Max didn't respond, but she knew he understood, because when the morning light finally peeked through the window, Lily's fever had broken, and Max was still there, holding her close, still keeping his silent promise. The day had started like any other. The air was crisp, the wind carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the sky, though overcast, gave no immediate sign of trouble. Margaret had spent the morning tidying up the house, keeping one ear tuned to the sounds of Lily's laughter drifting in from the backyard. Max, as always, stayed close, his steady presence a silent reassurance. Lily had taken to playing under the old maple tree, its branches now bare, save for a few stubborn leaves clinging to life. She twirled in circles, letting the cool breeze lift the edges of her sweater, her giggles echoing in the stillness of the afternoon. Max watched from a short distance, his dark eyes never straying too far from her tiny frame. Margaret, stepping onto the porch with a warm mug of tea, paused to admire the scene. A few months ago, she would have worried about letting Lily wander so freely. But now, with Max by her side, she felt a sense of security that had long been absent. She trusted Max in a way she never thought possible. Then, the first warning came. A low rumble rolled across the sky, distant yet unmistakable. Margaret's brows furrowed as she glanced up. The clouds had thickened, darkening at the edges, swelling with an ominous weight. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, sending spirals of leaves dancing across the yard. Max stood up immediately, his ears perked, his body tense. Margaret set down her mug. "Lily, sweetheart," she called. "Come here for a moment." Lily, mid-spin, barely acknowledged her grandmother. "It's windy," she squealed, arms spread wide as if she could take flight. Margaret stepped forward, concern creeping into her voice. "Lily, now!" But before Lily could react, the sky cracked open with a deafening roar. A bolt of lightning streaked across the horizon, illuminating the dark clouds with an eerie glow. The following clap of thunder rattled the windows, sending a shudder through the earth. Lily froze. The wind howled, no longer playful but urgent, frantic. And then it happened. A powerful gust surged through the yard, slamming the back gate shut with a forceful bang. Lily shrieked, startled by the sudden noise. Instinctively, she turned to run toward the house, but the wind pushed against her small frame, sending her stumbling sideways. Margaret's heart leaped into her throat. "Lily!" But before she could move, before she could reach her, Lily was gone. The wind had pushed her off balance, sending her past the gate, into the dense brush beyond the backyard fence. The latch had come loose, allowing the wooden gate to swing open just enough for her small body to slip through. Max reacted first. Before Margaret could even process what had happened, Max was already sprinting, his powerful legs propelling him forward in an instant. He ducked through the gap in the fence without hesitation, disappearing into the thickening storm. Margaret's pulse pounded. Panic seized her chest. "Lily!" she called again, but the wind swallowed her voice. She rushed down the porch steps, but she knew she wouldn't be able to reach Lily as fast as Max could. So she did the only thing she could. She prayed that Max would find her first. The forest behind the house wasn't vast, but in the growing storm, it felt endless. The trees swayed violently, their skeletal branches reaching out like desperate hands. Rain had started to fall, light at first, then heavier, turning the dry earth into slick mud. Lily's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She had never been in the woods alone before. The towering trees, the shadows stretching between them, the strange noises of the wind tearing through the branches. It was all too much. She stumbled, her tiny hands grasping at nothing as she fell onto the damp ground. The air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and earth, the cold seeping through her sweater. "Grandma!" she called, her voice barely a whisper against the storm. And then, movement. Something fast, something big. Lily curled into herself, squeezing her eyes shut. But the fear vanished as quickly as it came, because the next thing she felt was warmth. A familiar weight pressing close. Maximum. The giant Pitbull nuzzled against her, his fur wet from the rain, his body shielding her from the wind. His chest rose and fell in steady, calming breaths, his warmth instantly soothing the chill creeping into her bones. Lily let out a shaky sob and threw her arms around Max's thick neck. "You found me," she whispered. Max let out a low, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, a reassurance, a promise. Lily sniffled, burying her face into his fur, finding comfort in the steady presence of her protector. But Max wasn't still for long. He nudged her, urging her to stand. Lily wobbled but obeyed, gripping onto his fur for support. Max turned, glancing toward the house, toward the faint, flickering light of the porch barely visible through the trees. He took a step, then another. Lily followed. Slowly, carefully, they began their journey back. Margaret had never felt so helpless. She stood in the backyard, her hands trembling as she held onto the porch railing, her eyes locked onto the storm-tossed trees. Every second felt like an eternity. The rain soaked through her sweater, chilling her to the bone, but she didn't care. Then, through the haze of rain and darkness, movement. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Then she saw them. Max, emerging from the trees, his body hunched against the wind, and beside him, Lily. Margaret gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Lily!" The little girl, exhausted and shivering, lifted her head at the sound of her name. And then she was running, her tiny legs carrying her as fast as they could toward the warmth and safety of her grandmother's arms. Margaret met her halfway, dropping to her knees as Lily crashed into her embrace. "You're okay," Margaret whispered, pressing frantic kisses against Lily's damp curls. "Oh, sweetheart, you're okay." Lily sniffled, nodding against her shoulder. "Max found me." Margaret lifted her gaze, her eyes locking onto the Pitbull standing just a few feet away. Max was drenched, his dark fur slick with rain, his chest rising and falling with deep, heavy breaths, and yet he stood firm, strong, unshaken. Margaret reached out a hand. "Good boy," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Max hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, and in that moment, something changed. He wasn't just a protector anymore, he was family. As Margaret carried Lily inside, Max followed, shaking off the rain before settling at the foot of the couch. Lily curled up with a blanket, her eyes growing heavy, her tiny fingers still clutching onto Max's fur. Margaret sat beside them, running her hands through Lily's damp hair. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling against the windows. But inside, there was warmth, there was safety, and there was love. Margaret glanced at Max once more, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had once thought she was saving him, but tonight he had saved them, all of them. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. The ground outside was still damp, puddles reflecting the pale morning sun. The wind had died down, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. Inside the house, warmth had returned. Not just from the crackling fire in the living room, but from something deeper, something unspoken. Margaret sat on the couch, a steaming cup of tea resting between her hands. She wasn't drinking it. Instead, her eyes were fixed on the two figures curled up on the rug by the fireplace, Lily wrapped in a thick blanket, her small hand resting on Max's back, and Max stretched out beside her, his body completely still except for the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. They hadn't left each other's side since last night. Margaret had been awake for hours, replaying every moment of the storm in her mind. The fear, the helplessness, the overwhelming relief when Max had brought Lily home. She had known Max was protective of Lily, but now there was no doubt left. He wasn't just a pet. He was her guardian. Lily stirred, her tiny fingers curling deeper into Max's fur as she blinked up at her grandmother. "Good morning," she murmured sleepily. Margaret smiled, setting down her tea. "Good morning, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" Lily yawned, stretching slightly before cuddling closer to Max. "Better." Margaret exhaled, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. "That's good to hear." Max lifted his head slightly at the sound of their voices, his dark eyes scanning the room before resting back on Lily. He let out a slow, deep sigh, his tail thumping once against the floor. Lily giggled. "I think Max is tired, too." Margaret reached down, running her fingers gently over Max's head. "He was very brave last night." Lily nodded seriously. "He saved me." Margaret's heart clenched at the simple truth in those words. "Yes, he did." Silence settled between them for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came after something profound, something life-changing. Then Lily looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart." Lily hesitated. "Max won't ever leave me, right?" Margaret felt something deep inside her shift. The fear in Lily's voice, however small, was real. It was the fear of being left behind again. First, her mother, then her father. Max was the first thing in her life that had come back to her when she was lost. Margaret reached out, smoothing back Lily's messy curls. "No, honey. Max isn't going anywhere." Lily studied her grandmother's face for a moment, then nodded, satisfied with the answer. Max let out another long breath and nudged Lily's hand with his nose, as if to confirm what Margaret had just said. Lily beamed, throwing her arms around him in a tight hug. "I love you, Max." Margaret watched them, her throat tight. She had brought Max home thinking she was giving him a second chance. But the truth was, he had given all of them a second chance. A chance to heal, to trust, to be a family again. In the days that followed, life at the Wilson home settled into a new rhythm. Max had always been present in Lily's life, but now he was inseparable. Wherever Lily went, Max followed. When she played outside, he sat nearby, watching carefully. If she wandered too far, he herded her back gently, nudging her in the right direction. At night, when Margaret tucked Lily into bed, Max no longer stayed in the living room. Instead, he curled up beside her bed, his body stretched out just within reach of her small hand. If Lily stirred in her sleep, Max's ears flicked up, always alert. The house, once filled with an underlying sadness, now had a warmth that Margaret hadn't realized was missing. She had thought she was too old to raise a child again, too old to change. But watching Lily and Max together, she knew this was what she had been meant to do. One afternoon, as Margaret sat on the porch with a book in her lap, she overheard Lily talking to Max under the maple tree. "You're my best friend," Lily said matter-of-factly, patting Max's head. Max blinked slowly, his tail wagging once. "And Grandma says we're family now," she continued, her voice full of pride. "That means we have to take care of each other forever." Margaret smiled to herself, closing her book. Yes, forever. Word about what had happened during the storm had spread through the small town. A neighbor had spotted Max running through the trees after Lily and told the story at the local grocery store. Soon, everyone knew. At first, Margaret had worried about how people would react. A Pitbull saving a child. There were still so many misconceptions about the breed. But the reaction surprised her. One afternoon, while she was out running errands, an old friend, Mrs. Henderson, stopped her outside the bakery. "I heard about what happened," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "That dog of yours, he's something special." Margaret smiled. "He really is." "Pitbulls always made me nervous," Mrs. Henderson admitted. "But hearing what he did for Lily, maybe I was wrong about them." Margaret nodded, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. "Max isn't just a pit bull, he's family." And just like that, Margaret realized something else. Max wasn't just changing their lives. He was changing minds, too. That night, after dinner, Lily climbed onto the couch next to Max, curling up against his side. Margaret sat nearby, sipping her tea, watching the fire flicker in the fireplace. It had been months since Max had arrived. Months since she had hesitated, uncertain if he belonged in their home. Now she couldn't imagine life without him. She reached out, scratching behind Max's ears. He turned his head slightly, pressing into her touch. "Thank you, Max," she murmured. Max didn't respond, but he didn't need to. Margaret knew he understood. And as she looked at Lily, now fast asleep against Max's warm body, Margaret realized something else. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were healing, together. Some people believed that humans rescued dogs, but Margaret knew better now. Sometimes dogs were the ones who rescued us. And Max? He had saved them all. The seasons had shifted once again. The cold bite of winter had given way to the soft embrace of spring. The morning air was crisp, but carried the scent of new blossoms, and the once barren trees were now bursting with fresh green leaves. Life had returned to the town in full color, and with it, so had the warmth in the Wilson household. Margaret sat on the porch, the wooden chair beneath her creaking softly as she rocked back and forth. In her lap was a book, though she had long since stopped reading. Her gaze was fixed on the yard before her, where Lily ran barefoot across the grass, her laughter ringing through the air like the first birdsong of the morning. Max, ever watchful, moved alongside her, his massive frame a steady presence beside the tiny girl. It was a dance they had perfected over the past few months, Lily's boundless energy propelling her forward, Max's quiet patience keeping her safe. Margaret smiled to herself. It was strange to think about how much had changed in such a short time. She had once feared that her granddaughter would grow up feeling the weight of loss, the absence of a mother and father pressing down on her young heart. But looking at her now, stronger, happier, fearless, Margaret knew she had been wrong. Love had found its way into their lives in an unexpected form, with a wagging tail and deep, knowing eyes. She had rescued Max, or so she had thought. But in truth, he had rescued them all. Margaret let out a slow breath, turning her gaze to the sky, watching the wisps of clouds drift lazily overhead. "Grandma?" Lily's voice pulled her back to the present. The little girl came bounding up the steps, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Max followed close behind, his tongue lolling out in a satisfied pant. "Yes, sweetheart." Lily climbed onto Margaret's lap, wriggling into the comfortable embrace. "I taught Max a new trick." Margaret raised an eyebrow, pretending to be skeptical. "Did you now?" Lily nodded eagerly. "Watch!" She scrambled down and patted Max's side. "Max, sit!" Max, ever obedient, lowered himself to the ground with ease. "And now, high five!" Lily lifted her tiny hand, and Max, with perfect timing, raised his paw to meet it. Margaret chuckled, clapping her hands together. "Well, I'll be. You two are quite the team." Lily beamed. "He's the best dog ever." Margaret reached down to scratch behind Max's ears. "That he is." A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that only comes when hearts are truly at peace. Lily leaned against Max, resting her head against his warm fur. "Grandma?" Do you think Max knows how much I love him?" Margaret smiled, her heart swelling at the sincerity in Lily's voice. "Oh, sweetheart, I don't think there's a single doubt in his mind." Lily seemed satisfied with that answer. She let out a happy sigh, her small fingers playing with Max's fur. Margaret watched them for a moment before speaking again, her voice softer now. "You know, love comes in all kinds of ways. Sometimes it doesn't look the way we expect it to, but when it finds us, it changes everything." Lily looked up at her grandmother, curious. "Like Max?" Margaret nodded. Exactly like Max. The little girl was quiet for a moment, as if letting the thought settle. Then she reached out and hugged Max tightly. "I'm really glad he found us." Margaret blinked back the warmth in her eyes. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." The sun had risen higher now, casting golden light over the yard. The wind carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and wildflowers. It was a perfect morning, the kind that made Margaret feel that, despite everything, the world had a way of making things right. She had once feared that love was something fragile, something that could be lost and never found again. But now, she knew better. Love was strong. Love endured. And sometimes, love had 4 legs and a heart bigger than the sky. Margaret reached for her book again, though she knew she wouldn't be reading much today. Instead, she sat back, watching as Lily and Max played beneath the clear blue sky, their laughter and joy weaving into the morning air, a promise that, no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Because in the end, love was not just about the people who had left. It was about the ones who stayed. At its heart, this heartwarming story is about love, resilience, and the power of second chances. It reminds us that healing doesn't always come in the way we expect. Sometimes it arrives quietly, on 4 legs with a wagging tail and eyes that understand pain without judgment. Dog stories often explore themes of loyalty and companionship, but few bonds are as profound as the one between a child and a dog, especially one as misunderstood as a pit bull. This story challenges how we perceive not only animals, but also people. Pit bulls have long been misjudged, labeled as dangerous or unpredictable, yet here, we see a different truth. Max's journey, once abandoned, now fiercely loyal, mirrors the idea that no creature should be defined by their past. In the same way that Max finds a second chance, so does Lily, a little girl who has known loss before she could even understand it. Beyond stereotypes, this story highlights the power of unconditional love. Love is not about perfection or expectations. It is about showing up, about staying. Max does not need words to express devotion. His presence alone is enough. He protects, comforts, and stays beside Lily, embodying the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. More than just a dog story, this is a story of family, the kind built through loyalty and trust rather than blood. A grandmother raising her granddaughter alone. A child learning that love does not always mean loss. A dog proving that he is more than his breed, that he is not just a pet but a guardian, a friend and family. Perhaps the most powerful message is that healing does not happen in isolation. Just as Lily learns to trust Max and Margaret learns to see him beyond her doubts, we are reminded that love is found in the quiet, everyday moments. It is in the spaces between fear and trust, between loss and belonging. This story also carries a message beyond its characters. It challenges perception. Many fear what they do not understand. Just as Margaret's neighbors once viewed pit bulls with skepticism, they now see Max differently. One act of courage, one undeniable display of loyalty, has the power to change minds, to undo years of prejudice. In the end, this isn't just about a dog. It's about what it means to be human. It's about the importance of second chances, of looking past labels, of choosing love despite fear. And most of all, it's about realizing that sometimes the things we think we are saving are actually saving us. Because love, true love, is not about what we receive. It is about what we are willing to give. And sometimes love looks like a little girl and her dog, running beneath the golden sky, knowing that no matter what storms may come, they will always have each other. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.